In the next room, the famous movie star Jung Sung will show up. So everybody, is rushing today. So I expected nobody show up this room. So I admire your tolerance or your ignorance. So maybe that's why today the panelists should entertain our audience. So my foundation had special session, organized a special session from last year during the Jeju forums. During the last year, there's some tectonic, changes, in Northeastern Asia and in Korean Peninsula. So if we compare the title of both 2 years, we could sense what's going on and how drastically it's been changed. Last year's title was U.S.-China-Korea Cooperation in Transition, just in transition. But this year's topic should be a seismic shift of Korean Peninsula and U.S.-China relations. So everybody knows why we try to talk on seismic shift of Korean Peninsula in the wake of Singapore summit. But at the same time, we'd like to have some another light shed a light on U.S.-China relations. Maybe 10 or 15 years ago, Thucydides' trap, argued by Professor Allison and Mearsheimer, didn't get much attention. But as time elapsed, that kind of concern, enjoying more attention, even in the area of the academia. So now we'd like to link these two new developments, Korean Peninsula and also its impact on the U.S.-China relations in general. With that kind of premises in our mind, now I'm very happy to have the top world-class, the top panelists, from United States, China, and Korea. So if I give very just housekeeping rules, I will give 7 to 10 minutes for initial presentation, and then I will give another second round, a very short comment based on interactive or naturally originated questions or comment. So I will give another 2 to 3 minutes. And then I will open the floor for the Q&A session. Generally speaking, again, 7 to 10 minutes. But to be fair, I think it's better for me as a courtesy, not a respect for the world powers, but as a courtesy to the panelists who fly over than 15 hours. I will give you extra 2 minutes, okay? So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce my first, speakers. Dr. Gary Seymour, Executive Director for Research of the Belfer Center at Harvard University. He served twice as highest levels specialized in proliferation and WMD issues. During the Obama administration, he served as a White House coordinator for arms control and WMD. And during the Clinton administration, he was a special assistant to the president and senior director for non-proliferation and export control. So on top of that, Gary and myself struggled together for our special effort to make our North Korean nuclear deal as a great failure. We devoted more than 20 years. So I call him a working dictionary in the area of the North Korea nuclear crisis and world proliferation issues. So maybe he will give some his own general assessment on the Singapore summit, and then its implication, its global impact, as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Pak, and thanks to the Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies and the Jeju Forum. Great to be back here and to appear with such a terrific panel. So I think the Singapore meeting between President Trump and Chairman Kim has created a new opportunity to resume talks between the U.S. and North Korea on denuclearization. So that's a very positive outcome of the summit. At the same time, I think we have to recognize that the summit communique is very vague and doesn't resolve any of the critical issues related to that are related to denuclearization. For example, there's nothing on the timeline for when and how to achieve denuclearization, the phases. There's nothing on verification, and there's nothing on how denuclearization is linked to the other political elements in the summit communique, normalization of relations between the U.S. and DPRK, and the achievement of a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. So Secretary of State Pompeo has now inherited the very difficult job of translating the Singapore summit into a real concrete agreement with details and specific actions that the U.S. and North Korea will take. And I think that's going to be a very difficult challenge. Even if Kim Jong-un has made a strategic decision to give up his nuclear weapons in order to improve North Korea's economy, to modernize and strengthen the economy, denuclearization is still going to be difficult. But of course it will be even more difficult if North Korea is acting as it has in the past in previous U.S.-North Korea negotiations, where it's not really serious about giving up nuclear weapons, although might be prepared to accept some limits on the nuclear program in exchange for economic assistance and sanctions relief. So my recommendation to Secretary of State Pompeo is to focus the talks on getting some initial step that both the U.S. and North Korea could take that will begin the process of denuclearization. I call it a mini package. And in the mini package, North Korea could make a declaration of its nuclear facilities and program, and allow the and let international inspectors monitor and verify that that declaration is accurate. Because any further step North Korea takes, whether it's a freeze on activities or reduction of its forces or even final elimination, that will have to be based on a full and accurate declaration. And in return, I think the U.S. should be prepared to take some initial steps to move toward normalization of relations, lifting of economic sanctions, steps toward establishing peace on the Korean Peninsula, and coordinate with other countries, South Korea and China in particular, to provide economic benefits to North Korea in exchange for a full declaration of its nuclear program. Now, it will take months, if not more, to verify this first declaration by North Korea. Even if North Korea fully cooperates, it will take months to verify it. And while that verification process is going on, the U.S. and North Korea can negotiate a more comprehensive agreement that would be a step-by-step, phased roadmap that would ultimately lead at the end to denuclearization, peace regime, and normalization of relations. That could easily take the rest of the Trump administration to negotiate such a comprehensive agreement. And if, as the administration says, they intend to make that agreement a treaty, there will have to be additional time for the U.S. Senate to review and ratify the treaty, 2/3 vote. So my concern is that rather than spend the next 2.5 years negotiating and dragging out the talks, I think the U.S. and its allies should look for some early step North Korea could take, like a declaration, that would begin the process and that could run simultaneously with the more difficult task of trying to negotiate a comprehensive agreement. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Gary. If I give some immediate, the question on your observation, you're focusing on the role of the full declaration of the nuclear program. But if my memory is correct, North Korea tried to put that item at the last moment. Why North Korea tried to put it in the last phase? Maybe they got sour experience from the first nuclear crisis. They have some declaration of how much the plutonium they preserved, but it was proved that it's wrong. They lied. So can you make some why? And then on top of that, during the negotiation in Singapore, Bolton emphasized the Libyan model and the South African model. Why North Korea was strongly, vehemently object to the Libyan model, and they might imply some agreement with sympathy with some South African model. So can you make some elaboration on that?
So the South African model is, thank you. The South African model is a case where a country under a new government that came into power made a voluntary decision to declare and give up its nuclear weapons and the facilities to produce nuclear weapons. So we would like North Korea to follow the South African model, and if in fact Kim Jong-un has made a strategic decision to give up nuclear weapons, then the process of verifying and actually eliminating nuclear weapons can proceed fairly quickly, maybe a year or two. The other model is the North Korea model, which is to pretend to negotiate or pretend to be willing to give up nuclear weapons, but to have no intention of actually cooperating. And that's the model we've experienced over the last 30 years. And in particular, North Korea has never been willing to acknowledge having nuclear facilities outside of the Yongbyon nuclear center or allowing international inspectors to go outside the Yongbyon center. The reason why I propose that we seek a declaration as the first step is because that will give us an early indication of whether North Korea is going to follow the South African model, whether there's been a real change, or whether this is just more of the North Korea model that we've seen in the past. In any event, I think the process of negotiation is good for reducing tension and maintaining some limits on North Korea's nuclear program, like the current freeze on testing of nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. So even if North Korea is not willing to give up its nuclear weapons, we have an interest in prolonging the negotiation process in order to keep in place some limits on the nuclear program, such as the test freeze.
Thank you. Our next speaker will be Dr. Richard Bush, Director for the Center for East Asia Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. And also he headed American Institute in Taiwan from 1997 to 2002. The American Institute in Taiwan is equivalent of, from our point of view, the embassy, U.S. embassy in that place. So he served as a head of that institute, and he has seen at the Brookings Institution as one of the most influential China expert. So I'm really happy to make you present here. Okay, Richard.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Park. It's a great honor to be on this panel. This is actually my first time in Jeju, and so I want to thank you for making it possible for me to see this beautiful place. I'm going to talk about the United States and China and the North Korea problem at three levels. One is the level of negotiations. Second is the level of U.S.-China cooperation. And then third is what you might call the strategic configuration in East Asia. Now, when the U.S. intelligence community concluded in the early 1990s that Pyongyang had at least one nuclear weapon plus the infrastructure to produce more, it really shook the strategic stability of Northeast Asia. And I think all the states surrounding North Korea understood that this was a problem that would have to be addressed in some way. The question was how to do it. Since that time, the affected countries, South Korea, the United States, China, Japan, and Russia, have sought in different ways to get North Korea to abandon its policy objective of ensuring security with nuclear weapons. There were three efforts at negotiations to try and solve the problem. The agreed framework, the six-party talks, and the Leap Day Agreement all ended in failure. More recently, we've had an effort at economic sanctions and enhancing deterrence, so-called maximum pressure, but that did not divert North Korea from its goal. And now we have a fourth effort to reverse North Korean ambitions through negotiations. In the last 25 years, the United States and China have gradually expanded cooperation concerning the Korean Peninsula. China was not really a player with the agreed framework. In 2003, it was so afraid that the George W. Bush administration was going to undertake regime change in North Korea that it initiated what became the six-party talks. It's true that Beijing and Washington ranked denuclearization, peace, and stability differently, but their sense of shared interest grew as Kim Jong-un advanced both the missile program and the nuclear program. Of course, this U.S.-China cooperation went far beyond the Korean Peninsula, and there's always been an emphasis by the two countries to try to expand the areas of cooperation and manage differences in the meantime. The Iran Agreement and the Paris Climate Agreement were two landmark fruits of this cooperative spirit, but unfortunately President Trump pulled the U.S. out of both of those, and so North Korea is the main area where we cooperate. Now, returning to the Korean Peninsula, over the last 15 years, China, the United States, South Korea, Japan, and Russia have had differing levels of willingness to collaborate. The main divide for a long time was between Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo on one side, and Beijing and Moscow on the other. The United States and China disagreed over how hard to press North Korea. Each had its own understanding of the fundamental problem, and each thought the other was doing too little to solve the problem. But as I said, collaboration increased as North Korea more frequently conducted nuclear tests and missile tests, sanctions broadened in scope, deepened in enforcement, and so this became more and more of a success story in U.S.-China relations. Now, thinking for just a minute about the strategic configuration in East Asia, I would argue that for much of the last 40 years, Beijing and Washington have been comfortable with the idea of these two big countries coexisting in the same region. I think Beijing understood that the United States would remain a significant actor in the region, while the United States accepted that China was on the way to reviving itself as a great power. I think both were very realistic that this strategic transition would produce a lot of frictions, but there was a shared confidence in the ability to manage them. So that's the situation up till now at these three levels: negotiations, bilateral cooperation, and strategic configuration. Now I think the situation appears to be changing. On the one hand, South Korea and North Korea are taking independent and parallel initiatives to jumpstart negotiations on a range of fundamental issues. In the process, Pyongyang is reducing its international isolation, and I think South Korean President Moon Jae-in is really setting the pace of change, and he's emphasizing the priorities of the progressive camp. So the United States, China, Russia, and Japan are all sort of scrambling to catch up. And so in this context, the June 12th meeting in Singapore takes on a special significance. Now, I've always believed that it's useful in thinking about North Korea to distinguish between communications and negotiations. The two are very different. And it's really through communications that you figure out whether negotiations on a mutually acceptable basis are even possible. And then, as Gary has said, once you get into negotiations, there are various ways to manage it, and some can be sustained longer than others. I think, coming back to Singapore, that President Trump's expectations for this meeting were pretty high at the beginning, but they declined the closer we got to June 12th. I agree with Gary's basic analysis of the result of the meeting. I'm not going to go over it myself. In an optimal world, this communication will lead to serious and productive negotiations, but it's uncertain at this point. I personally am skeptical that the two sides will reach any full agreement, since, in my view, their respective goals are mutually contradictory. According to Secretary Pompeo, the United States still wants CVID. North Korea has made it pretty clear that it is going to keep its nuclear weapons. I truly hope I'm being too pessimistic. But if I'm correct that a mutually acceptable outcome is highly unlikely, then the negotiating track will, at least as it involves North Korea and the United States, will slow down or even halt. And we may see a return to maximum pressure. So that's negotiations, or the possibility of negotiations. What about U.S.-China cooperation? Conventional wisdom would suggest that U.S.-China cooperation regarding the Korean Peninsula will continue. However much Seoul and Pyongyang can create more freedom of action for themselves, United States and China are still going to be necessary to achieve a good outcome. But if U.S.-North Korea negotiations break down, I fear that U.S.-China cooperation will also decline. And we may well return to the days when the United States and China disagreed over the danger in the Korean Peninsula, disagreed on the risks, and disagreed on which side should take the initiative, Beijing or Washington. Finally, I think that for the first time, and in part because of Korean developments, we can't rule out the possibility that the goals of Washington and Beijing are changing in an unprecedented way, leading to a change in strategic configuration. On the one hand, China's been signaling for some time that it would prefer that Asian countries take a lot more responsibility for security issues in their region. By implication, that means a reduction in the significant role for the United States. And the Trump administration, its documents, its policy documents, suggest that the administration believes that's what China is doing. On the other hand, whatever U.S. policy documents say, we should keep in mind that for over 30 years, Donald Trump believed, rightly or wrongly, that our allies, including the Republic of Korea, have been free riding on U.S. defense commitments and on the forward deployment of our armed forces. And a recent article in the Washington Post suggested that his view hasn't really changed. And so we have to contemplate a the possibility of some degree of strategic withdrawal by the United States. So even as negotiations on the North Korean nuclear problem are undergoing fairly significant change, and even though future and because future cooperation between the United States and China and North Korea is uncertain, also the basic regional strategies of the United States and China are also changing. I frankly have no idea what will happen. As President Trump says, we shall see. Thank you.
Thank you. I will give some very brief comment. Maybe I hope you will reply during your second round. First question is, the U.S.-China relationship is some coupling effect, the inter-Korean, development. So, but in case of the something wrong in Korean Peninsula, it might U.S.-China relations might be in jeopardized situation. So it means that do you agree with the Thucydides trap, as argued by Mearsheimer or Allison's? So that's my first question. Second question is, you are the best, the Taiwan specialist in China, in United States. If my memory is correct, Taiwan tried to develop nuclear program in 1985 or a little later. So why, Taiwan tried to develop a nuclear weapon at that time, and what was, U.S. response to that issues? Maybe you have a clear memory, so maybe I hope you share with us during your second round. Yeah. So, and then now I'd like to introduce my Chinese colleague, Dr. Cheng Xiaohe, if my Songtiao is right. So he's a senior researcher of the Pangol Institute, who also teaches at Renmin University of China. So maybe he's very popular among young generation in Korea. So that's why I intentionally, tried to invite him to our place. So he's a leading professor, especially representing the new generation. So I expect your thought on current situation. Thank you.
Thank you, President Park, and also thank you very much for your kind invitations. And I would like to make my a brief introduction to the ongoing situations associated with Korea Peninsula. One is the big changes on the world stage with China's emerge as the second largest economies. And 150 years ago, and one of China's leading politicians, Li Hongzhang, used the words to characterize new situations, according to him, quote unquote, not exactly. And the enemy, the Western powers, are so powerful that China hasn't faced for 1,000 years. And they change the situations China live with. It's something China haven't witnessed for several thousand years. I think we are now in the same situations. The world is facing a new situations the humankind haven't witnessed for several thousand years. And China, as a powerful state, is a country, and many countries haven't faced for 1,000 years. So such a kind of dramatic change certainly will have huge impact, not only on China and the United States relation, China and the European relation, but also on China and to current relations. And we have to understand what's going on Korea Peninsula and in Northeast Asians against such a kind of a dramatic backdrop. And for me, it's, the Singapore summit certainly is a good start of the negotiations between United States and North Korea, and also a good start for the whole situations on Korea Peninsula. But for me, I sensed some big changes on United States positions, United States policies toward North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. One is United States and President Trump softened his positions on the timetable of North Korea's denuclearizations. And the joint statement certainly didn't mention that. And in President Trump's press conference, and he had no ideas from my observations. The timetable sort of looks like. And that's the one thing. Without a concrete timetables, it's hard to say whether or not the mission to persuade or pressure North Korea to give up the nuclear weapons will be accomplished. The second changes on the United States policy toward North Korea's nuclear programs is the very concept of CVID may evolve into CVD. The letter I maybe disappear in the futures, because I believe the United States may pursue a limited face saving rather than a total victories in dealing with North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. In other words, the United States may seek the eliminations of ICBM and the nuclear weapon hardwares, rather than the eliminations of North Korea's nuclear capabilities. So I built such a kind of things, and may be wrong, but next week, very soon, United States and North Korea will have high-level discussions attended by U.S. State Secretary Pompeo. And I believe the high-level discussions will produce something good. And the discussion would be fruitful for three reasons. Number one, and Trump didn't get major concessions from North Korea in Singapore. According to Trump's personalities, he must get something in returns for the next negotiations. Otherwise, Trump will walk away from the talks with North Korea. So next time, it's North Korea's turn to make concessions. Second, for North Korea, if North Korea is willing to give up the nuclear weapons, and its intention to pursue denuclearization of Korea Peninsula is real, and I think the timetables, CVID, is not a matter of great concern for that countries. They are technical issues could be settled in the quite effective and efficient ways. Third, Sino-U.S. relations become increasingly uncertain, challenging, and if full-blown trade war between China and the United States breaks up in the future, and the cooperations between two countries in dealing with North Korea nuclear and ICBM issues will be greatly undermined. So it's better for United States and North Korea to move as quickly as possible to cut deals. So I believe the high-level generations may produce good results, and the good results would help to pave the way for the second summit between Kim and Trump. And first, China's role on U.S. and the DPRK's negotiations, and many people believe with the worsening relationship between China and the United States, China may play not very good roles. I think it's North Korea's determination to seek diplomatic normalizations with United States. This determination is strong. And this country has pursued these objectives for more than 40 years. So now, realizations of diplomatic recognitions with the United States within a reach. Why North Korea will give up such kind of efforts? So, no matter what's going on between China and the United States, and North Korea will continue to press ahead to seek improved relationship with the United States. And China have no say in that regard. I'm going to stop here. Run over the time. Thank you.
Okay, before I make some comment, can you elaborate what ADV stand for instead of CVID? You mentioned AVD.
CVD. I mentioned CVD.
Complete verifiable.
Complete verifiable denuclearizations.
But you.
That's a misspelling.
Okay. Thank you. I have maybe if I follow your good argument, if we could have some second summit, it symbolizes great success because next time North Korea should present something. So
hopefully.
From your judgment, when the second round of summit will be convened?
A lot of the guests, and I think that one guest that may take place on July 27, and that's a very good days. And also the summit may take place in September, October in the United States, and Kim Jong-un may make a trip to United Nations Assembly to make a good speech, and at the same time to have meetings with President Trump.
Okay, thank you. And you have very interesting separation between the concept of elimination of nuclear weapon and elimination of the capability. So it's very interesting, very useful, distinction. But in that case, how, to make it, to eradicate the capability, how you could erase the experience and technology which is residing on their brain. So it's another issue. So maybe I hope your ideas during the next round of intervention. Okay, our next speaker will be Dr. Linan, research fellow for the Institute of American Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, the largest and the best Chinese think tank. He was a visiting scholar at Seoul National University and Brookings Institution and SAIS at Johns Hopkins. He frequently visits Kim Il-sung University, and I think he's the Actually, I think he lived in North Korea.
For a while. For a while.
So, and also, he is a member of our foundation's, exchange scholars, leading scholars exchange program, which we call it ESEF program. So under our program, he studies Seoul National University for 1 year. So maybe he's the best, excellent young professors. Who has the best knowledge on, especially North Korean nuclear issues. Okay.
Thank you.
Dr. Lee?
Yeah, it's my honor to be here. I really appreciate for the KFAS for having me here. And also I'm very honored to sit with my former bosses, either Brookings Institute, Richard, and also Zhongtangnim, Ambassador Pa. Also, I'm seeing my supervisor in Renmin University, Professor Shi Yunhong there. So let me very nervous going back to the university immediately. So I like to talk about the North Korea views on this issue. And this is my opinion. So last year, because of North Korea keeping testing nuclear and also launching the missiles, so we can see the countries around North Korea make all effort to take sanction against North Korea. It's just really big pressure to North Korea. But this year, when North Koreans talk about giving up nuclear weapon, you can see everyone plays the game by themselves. And no one have a clear policy toward North Korea. And you can see this is a North Korean opportunity for survive and succeed. So actually, there's one thing very clear. We don't have a clear definition of denuclearization in Korean Peninsula. From North Korean view, this is a denuclearization of Korean Peninsula, not denuclear North Korea. So they're afraid of there's a possibility for South Korea to have a nuclear weapon and or get nuclear weapon from America. So that's why they say denuclearization of Korean Peninsula. But for us, denuclearization of Korean Peninsula, just North Koreans should have a denuclear themselves. This is a big difference between the countries. And so also we don't have the very clear roadmap for how to make North Korean denuclear themselves. This is, if we have a clear definition of denuclearization, then we can make effort to tell North Korea, see, this is a role plan we are making, and you have to accept that. But so that's why right now we can hear a lot of voices saying CVID, PVID, Libya model, and so many definitions on denuclearization. And I think we should make effort and sit together and define the denuclearization. And this is should be our proposal, not he or his or others' proposal. So that is what I'm thinking. And the second one I have to talk about North Korea. What happening in North Korea right now? I think yesterday I read the Rodong Sinmun, and so it's very funny because from yesterday the anti-imperialist education part disappeared. Until now, I cannot find any this education in the Rodong Sinmun. And also, there's every day there's a economic, how to improve economic in North Korea in Rodong Sinmun, the first pages and the third pages. It's very interesting for us because they talk about the wrong thinking in the economic the sectors in economic. And also they are really rethink of their systematic problem. And also, when I moved to Korea, my friend sent me an email showing there's Kim Jong-il's article make the speech before he died, and very funny, not funny, very serious, because I thought there's a kind of like they printed in 2015, but they published this book. This article was published last year, the end of last year. And the two things Kim Jong-il talked. First things, the systematic problem, and he talked about the organization of the guardians, this department, and he mentioned this problem, what happened in this department a lot, and showing he rethink of this government, the department, and there's so many weaknesses for North Korea to have a development. And the second one is economic. Kim Jong-il said we have to make all effort to improve our economic. So that's why I think Kim Jong-un really this time really have a strategic change from the military first to the economic-oriented development. And I think recently North Korean have Kim Jong-un have their idea that first one definitely make all effort to improve their economic and have a strategic systematic change. And second one, he want to improve relationship with South Korea, and I don't think he will not change. And third, this step-by-step denuclearization, and he want to keep that plan. And fourth, this is a Korean socialism with Korean characteristic. He will not. That means he will not rely on any great power, and he want to, especially the economic, to be more independent. And fourth, right now he think the top issue is how to improve relationship with China. I think recently this is a North Korean think other word to the outside, and also for the foreign policy, I think North Koreans still want to take responsibility when they find out there's a problem between the great power. So this is their opportunity for survive and succeed. And right now he realized there's a problem between China and the United States and Russia and the United States. That's why he take this opportunity to develop themselves. And also he really want to know what Donald Trump looks like, and that's why he really take care of the Donald Trump. Finally, he think Donald Trump first one is less ideological, and second one he probably will be a very good deal maker. So that's why this is a North Korean opportunity to take position and take advantage in Korean Peninsula. That's why in North Korea right now, he thinks this is a really good environment for North Korean to develop themselves. And so that's why inside North Korea, there's a huge voices to hope, to wish to develop North Korean economy. Outside, there's a really good opportunity because the problem between the powers is really huge, and they can take advantage for survival. That's why finally I think the only issue they can accept the denuclearization of North Korea, that it is the country like China, United States, and South Korea, and more countries can make all effort to work together to deal with this issue. Otherwise, if we just do solve with this problem with ourselves, by our interest, there's no hope for North Korea to denuclearize themselves. Also, there's no hope for the everlasting peace in Korean Peninsula. Thank you.
I'd like to raise some common question to my Chinese colleague. There might be two kinds of survival. Survival of North Korean system or regime. The other survival is the survival of the leader himself. So in that sense, the Singapore summit was great success to, and the second, the latter, the survival of Kim Jong-un himself. Why? The Kissinger's, great bargain, it was concentrated on some dealing North Korean future in case there's some contingency happened. So maybe China developed some ideas against many possible scenario of North Korean future. But usually, especially there's some rumor that Chinese military side prepare some refugee camp penetrating into the North Korean territory in case of to protect or to prepare against any eruption of North Korean refugees in case of emergency. Yeah. So, which means that that kind of idea was, based on presumption that Kim Jong-un's regime will not last long. But now, in the wake of the Singapore summit, that kind of concern has been disappeared. So, North Korean regime became more normalized. So, in that sense, is there any clear change of Chinese perception vis-a-vis North Koreans, the instability, especially in case of Kim Jong-un's regime? So that is my questions, which I need some answers during your second, round of talk. Now, next speaker will be Ambassador An Ho-young. He's a previous Korean ambassador to the United States. He enjoyed the longest longevity as ambassador to United States because he served there 4.5 years. So maybe during the last several decades, nobody will break that record. So he's enjoying every wisdom and on-site experience. So that's why I especially invite him to our site, to share his very brilliant wisdom and insight. Thank you.
Well, how to stay long in a position? Don't say too much. But at the same time, I have 3 points, and then very quick 3 points. My first point, of course, it will be assessment of Singapore summit, which happened on June 12th. And then a large number of panelists, they already referred to that. But what I truly think about the true meaning and assessment of Singapore summit is this, which is maybe we will have to wait several years. Maybe we will have to wait several decades even in order to fully understand what in fact was achieved or what was not achieved in Singapore. But at the same time, of course, we cannot wait that long. So for the time being, I think we need a working definition or working assessment of Singapore summit. And I think if you want me to reduce it to one single sentence, it will be this, which is, it was a meeting short on substance and long on possibility. And then I don't think I have to explain what I mean by that. It was very short on substance, but very long on possibility. And Richard has already considered by saying, right? And I take it as an expression of consent, right? But at the same time, this gap between short substance and long possibility is huge. Question is how to bridge this gap, right? So that leads me to my second point, which is wish list. And what I mean by that is this, which is this gap should be bridged by somebody, and I think most probably it would have to be done by Pompeo, Secretary of State Pompeo. And then maybe, maybe we will need second summit meeting or third summit meeting, and then that's what President Trump has already considered. Well, this, in fact, is a process. Maybe one meeting may not be sufficient. So maybe that, in fact, is something which we are going to observe in the months and years to come. So what we can do, what you and we can do, we are not going to be involved in the negotiation. So I think we can do is we try to come up with a wish list so that we could be sharing them with Mr. Pompeo as well as President Trump. And then on the top of the wish list, I think we must clarify once again about the goal of our negotiation. And then the goal of the negotiation must continue to be CVID. Why do I say that? It's because I know there are many skeptics. There are many skeptics who don't believe at the end of the day we'll be able to achieve CVID. And my observation is that list of skeptics is growing even longer. And at this panel, and then of course there was Professor Chang who said, well, I don't think it is going to be a CVID. Most probably, if it is going to be CVD. So that, in fact, attests to my observation in the sense that the list of skeptics is growing longer and longer. But to all those skeptics, I have to tell you this, which is, if North Korea remains as a nuclear state, then I think it will continue to be a serious challenge for security, stability, and prosperity in Northeast Asia. So that, in fact, is a single most important reason why it must be a CVID. Second on my wish list would be how we get there. And then, as a matter of fact, there was an agreement in 1994, and then there was an agreement in 2005, there was an agreement in 2012. And I think in those agreements, we had very good elements of the methodology that we should be subscribing to in order to achieve this goal of CVID. And then elements would be freeze. And then, of course, there is a freeze for the time being, freeze under testing. But, of course, that's a good start, but there are far more activities that should be frozen. And then, well, declaration is something, the importance of which has been emphasized by Gary, and I fully agree. I mean, real serious negotiation cannot start with declaration. And then several weeks ago, there was a widely reported scope of nuclear facilities in North Korea, and what did it say? No less than 3,000 nuclear facilities in North Korea. And then without, well, having idea about the scope of nuclear facilities in North Korea, we will not get very far. And verification. Verification, in fact, was an essential element in 1994, 2005, 2012. And then if verification was important in 1994 and then 2005, then of course you will understand why verification is so important. So that, in fact, would be the methodology. But the third element on my wish list would be this, which is that let us always think about the leverage. What other leverages we have in order to make progress on negotiation for denuclearization with North Korea. And then for that leverage, then we have been talking about time, diplomatic sanction, information sanction, military sanction, and economic sanction. And then, of course, those sanctions would have played certain role in bringing North Korea to the table for negotiation. But at the same time, there is much concern spread in Korea, in Washington, D.C., and in other parts of the world. Are we not giving up our leverage too early? And that concern is there. So that, in fact, would be the third point on my wish list. So that is my second point, that is to say wish list. My third and last point, that will be about the role or roles to be played by the United States and China. And then on this particular point, then of course I was listening very closely to Dr. Bush. And on several different occasions, Richard, you talked about strategic configuration. And that, in fact, that is to say, strategic configuration between China and United States, it has emerged as, I think, the most important strategic question for the 21st century. And Ambassador Park has been raising this question about Thucydides trap, and then why Graham Allison wrote that book. again, he was addressing the same question, which is how to address this strategic relationship between China and the United States. And then in that context, I'm being reminded again and again about what Henry Kissinger said in his book on China. What did he say? It's a huge book, but it could be reduced to one single sentence, which is, between United States and China, try to find issues on which the two of them could work together. Between United States and China, try to find issues on which United States and China could work together. And again, I'm just getting back to what we just heard from Dr. Bush, and then he said, well, several years ago, there were so many different issues on which United States and China could work together. One, climate change. Two, JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Comprehensive Plan of Action. They are gone now. Climate change is gone. Iran deal is gone. So almost the only thing which remains on the list for constructive engagement between United States and China, that in fact is North Korea. I think that is another reason why I think between leaders in the United States and China, they should understand not only the tactical importance, but also strategic importance of this issue, why it should be resolved. And as I repeat myself, I think the only way this issue could be resolved would be when we, again, clarify the goals we should be pursuing, which must be CVID, and then we, in fact, should have clearer understanding about what needs to be done. That is to say, freeze, declaration, verification, and then, well, in a sense, muster all the leverages we can muster so that we will be getting there. Thank you.
Thank you. And as I explained before, his eloquent speech blocked any further question. So, but if I squeeze out one question, based on Richard's argument. He gave some warnings to Korean side that there's some widespreading perception that during the last 3 or 4 decades, Korea enjoyed free riding in terms of our defense the budget. So as a former ambassador for such a long time, you might have some say against his argument, not his argument, his observation. So I hope you could say something, or Professor Lee, who is expert on that issues, could make some other complimentary comment during the second round talk. Okay. Now the last speakers, but not least. I'm very delighted to introduce Dr. Lee Gun-wook. He's a professor of political science at Sogang University. He's really almost the only expert in exploring the power of the military service in various area, especially in the advanced technology area in military part. So, she has some great interest, in that area. After he got PhD at Harvard on that in these military issues. So I invited him to share his specialties in this area. So. Professor Lee.
First, I'd like to show my my thanks to the Korean Foundation for Advanced Studies for two things. The first, the foundation financed my studies in the United States 20 years ago, and the second, for inviting me to this prestigious arena, giving me a chance to talk in front of this crowd. The thing is that we have the two declarations of the summits. The one is the Panmunjom Declaration between the Moon Jae-in and the Kim Jong-un, and the second is the Singapore Summit between Kim and and Trump. The thing is that the situation has been changed, and this new situation of the new course of change is better than the what we used to have a year before. And personally, I truly believe that it is imperative for us to keep this course of action to stay. However, I'm still puzzled how to keep this moving, the movement ahead. We have a couple of issues. As Gary Seymour said, that we still don't know how willing, how sincere, or genuine that the North Koreans are about so-called denuclearization. And also we have a lot of kind of different understandings about the same issues. For example, the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, for example. Traditionally, North Koreans said that nuclear weapon is not an item to trade, and we will not give up the nukes for anything. And Kim Jong-un said that, quote, the true national treasure that we will not abandon under any circumstances. That's what North Koreans have said for decades or something. However, we have a different position, or it seems to that North Koreans change their positions in these days. The question is, how can we test North Korea's sincerity on these days? As Lin Nan said, that we have some kind of different understanding about the same word. I mean, the North Koreans have been consistent or the persistent of the demand for the negotiations, for example. Traditionally, North Koreans said that we need to denuclearize the whole Korean peninsula, not the North Korea, which means that the withdrawal of the U.S. security guarantee or the commitment to South Korea and extended deterrence and the nuclear umbrella should be out of the Korean peninsula. However, we don't know yet whether North Korea truly changed their positions. We have some anecdotal report that North Korea changed their positions about the U.S. military presence in the Korean Peninsula, for example. But we still don't know. That is one of the many reasons, in addition to the North Korea's track record in renegating upon the many of its promises in previous decade or two. So I'd like to propose some way to test whether North Koreans are truly sincere, genuine, or truly willing to cooperate with the rest of the world, which means that giving up their nuclear weapons, and also Lin Nan said that to develop its own economy. How is it possible? Theoretically speaking, under some circumstances, North Koreans would say that this and this thing. We have three ways to deal with this new or the seemingly new positions by Pyongyang. The first is simply accept North Korea's new position. We just trust them. Second, we simply disregard all of their new position. Third is a test. So in here, we need something. We are going to demand something that only sincere type of North Koreans would accept, which means it is that some kind of a military reduction of North Korea's 1.3 billion soldiers. Everybody knows that in this room that North Korea has 1.3 billion soldiers. I believe this is too much. And everybody would agree that. And North Korea would be willing to demobilize 500,000 soldiers out of North Korea's People's Army. It has a couple of advantages. For example, numerical control is verifiable. It is much easier and more verifiable than eliminating nuclear warhead in many examples, in many senses. And also, the mobilization is good for Kim Jong-un in three ways. The first, 1.3 million men in uniform is too much burden, financial, political, and economic burden for the North Korea, whose economy is barely functioning. Given that Kim Jong-un announced to develop his economy, he should find resources to invest out of somewhere. KPA's manpower is the best place to start, I believe. The second is, if denuclearized, however unlikely or likely it might be, North Korea will get capital, money, from the outside world to develop its economy. However, it needs to find the labor. It needs to find the manpower to produce anything. North Korea cannot hire foreign laborers. Maybe South Korea, maybe Japan, maybe United States, maybe China. Anybody can provide the capital to produce something in Pyongyang. However, North Koreans should find its own manpower to match. 1.3 million soldiers are the best place to start, I believe. The third one is demobilization would boost Kim's chance to stay at the power. Given that the KPA, the Korea People's Army, is a kind of a political challenger to his power, Kim needs to undermine the influence of the KPA's leadership by many measures. For example, appointing loyal guard on the top positions and replacing this leadership regularly and quite often. In this sense, demobilization is the best way, and the demobilization might be a good idea for Kim Jong-un to survive at Pyongyang, and also to get untrustworthy generals, so-called retired. Demobilization is important. People in this room and in this panel as well are talking about the nuclear issues and the CVID. However, I want to raise the more important and more urgent issue from the viewpoint of South Koreans. Nuclear weapons are important. However, the conventional threat, the threat that we are used to, threat that we are kind of so get accustomed to, therefore we are very easily, we just barely remember or barely feel. However, this threat still exists, and this threat is a kind of existential threat to South Korea. We need a further step. If we are blocked in the nuclear process, maybe we need a kind of a way to bypass that block. Maybe we need more and additional ways to overcome these difficulties in the CVID issues and building trust between two Koreas, building trust between Pyongyang and Washington. Okay, let me stop here.
Thank you. Now we have 20 minutes to go. So now I'd like to give the second round, very quick, 2 to 3 minutes. So if I had one more things, you mentioned some serious intent. I fully agree with you. The full declaration of the nuclear program is the crystal clear, the intent. But on top of that, what kind of measure could be recognized as things? A nuclear test site explosion is a marginal, impact, and repatriation of the POW remain. It's nothing new. So please, indicate what kind of measure could be construed as.
So once you had a declaration in hand that was full and complete, the next obvious step would be to freeze additional production of fissile material, just as Ambassador An mentioned. And that would limit the size of North Korea's nuclear arsenal. Or if you wanted to be more ambitious, you could freeze production of additional types of missiles. Again, that would require access to those missile production facilities, which North Korea has never allowed in the past. And then once you have a freeze in place, once you've capped the size of the nuclear arsenal, the next logical step is to begin to talk about reductions. So let's say North Korea has 50 nuclear weapons. Then you would want to try to work out some kind of an arrangement to gradually reduce those number of nuclear weapons as you work your way toward complete elimination. Now, I have to be honest, I think such a process is going to be stretched out over many years, even if it's possible. I'm not sure it is. I think we should continue to maintain the goal of CVID, but I think we have to appreciate that North Korea is very unlikely to quickly give up its nuclear weapons, which they've been working on for 30 years, and which they've had in place for the last decade. So I think if we could get a declaration and a freeze in the next couple of years, that would be a major achievement, something we haven't been able to get since the 1994 agreement. And of course, that collapsed because of North Korean cheating.
Okay.
You had two questions. Let me do the Taiwan question first. Taiwan started a nuclear program in the latter part of the 1960s after China tested a nuclear weapon in 1964. The United States caught Taiwan doing this in the 1970s, and I think it was 1978. We thought we had shut it down. And then we discovered in the mid-'80s that we hadn't shut it down, that Taiwan had cheated. And we came in very forcefully and essentially ordered them to shut it down. This order was successful because Taiwan at that point was so dependent on the United States for its security that it really could not say no. Two things have happened since then. Number one, I think that U.S. Commitments to help protect Taiwan have been more credible than they were in the late 70s, early 80s. Second, Taiwan's democratization, which put a whole different approach to nuclear power, nuclear weapons, and so on. So at this point, Taiwan is quite a green country. On the Thucydides trap, the basic idea is that the ambitions of a rising power encroach so much on those of a status quo power that the probability of military conflict goes up. This is a very serious hypothesis and deserves to be treated seriously. Now, I think, for my own thinking, conceptually, we have to ask three questions. First of all, are the goals of the rising power and the established power in fundamental conflict? When we talk about the United States and China, I would say no, that we have some shared interests with respect to issues like North Korea. We have deep economic interdependency. I think that the last 10 years have been more problematic. North Korea has been a success story up till this point. I worry that Donald Trump is putting at risk a very important economic interdependence relationship. Second question, are the rising power and established power each unwilling to take into account the fears of the other? And I think that, we did a pretty good job for the first 3 decades after 1979. One example is the MOU that Barack Obama and Hu Jintao did in 2014 to reduce risks in the maritime and air domain. Very important step. Third question, but still I fear that the perception that each country has about the intentions of the other are getting more and more fearful and more locked in. Third, does the rising power and the established power give unqualified support to allies who do not necessarily obey the wishes of their patron? Again, I think in the U.S. and China case, each has done a pretty good job on this score. The United States restrained Taiwan in the late 1990s and during the 2000s on the issue of Taiwan independence. North Korea has been clear on its expectations of North Korea. So a trap does not yet exist for the United States and China. They haven't fallen into the trap, but the trend isn't so good. Thanks.
Charles?
And one question, and
It's up to you. Whatever.
I think it's to achieve the denuclearizations of Korea Peninsula basically depend on two key factors. One is North Korea's intentions, real intentions. If North Korea resists all kinds of offers and single-mindedly press ahead with nuclear weapons, nobody can stop it. And the second, China and the United States cooperations. You see, in the past years, China and the United States could cooperate with each other, even though such a kind of cooperation was uneasy. But still, the two countries could cooperate with each other. But now, the situation is changing. The United States designated China as a strategic competitor. The United States has taken measures in order to try to get its trade and other concessions from China. And even though the full-blown trade war may be avoided, but damages has been done on China and the United States relations. The mutual suspicions on both sides is running deep, and it's become increasingly difficult for two countries to continue their cooperation in dealing with North Korea's issues. Even though I personally believe to pursue CVID serve China's best interest, and to continue to work with the United States to pressure or persuade North Korea to give up the nuclear weapons serve China's national interest. But things become so complicated, and I think as Chinese leaders will feel hard to continue such a kind of cooperation with the United States. And you may remember, and Pompeo, not a long time ago, Pompeo visited China, and to do things both. One, tell China that the United States government will impose new tariff on China on July 7. At the same time, he asked China continued cooperation in dealing with North Korea's nuclear issues. And he was in awkward situations. He can do so, but the United States will find it's extremely difficult to have both.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I think China's policy toward North Korea and Korean Peninsula is very clear. This first one, no war, and especially right now when North Korea declared to give up nuclear weapon, so China this goal, the message from China is very clear: no war, and the nuclear issue should be solved with only peaceful means. And second, China wants to introduce the experience for Chinese reform and open policy toward North Korea, and this is also very clear. And when Kim Jong-un visited China the third time, Chairman Xi Jinping said 3 no changes. The party relationship will not be changed, and the Chinese feeling toward North Korean people is not changed, and the support toward North Korea will be not changed. But the precondition is the free nuclear Korean Peninsula. That's why this is a very clear message toward North Korea. North Koreans should be denuclearized themselves, and I think this is a very clear. And also, I think if North Korea really give up nuclear weapon and go to the economic road, and then I think China will help North Korea with many ways. But the first way is how to change North Korean concept, and I think that is China. For Chinese, it's very easy and very important to do, because right now how to define the market. China took many long years to defend the market economy in the party, and I think North Korea right now is facing the same challenges, and because there's a very lot of free market in North Korea, how the party defends the market position is very important, and China can help North Korea to change their idea, especially when China took the reform and open policy in 1980s. So the biggest challenge is the concept change, and so I think right now North Korea is facing the challenge too. So that's why if North Korea give up the nuclear weapon and focus on economy, I think China can help them to change their idea first. And for the assistance, I think China still keep the sanction against North Korea. And when I was in Beijing, and I can hear a lot of complaint from my North Korean friends, say there's no any lift up sanction from China. So I think China still keep up. And for the economic assistance, China have to wait until the sanction lift up. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And then the question is about Korea free riding. And then before I respond to the question, I just want to comment very briefly about the last point, which has been made by Professor Lee, which is the level of sanction that China is maintaining upon North Korea. I'm coming from another session, and then in the session there was one of the panelists was Professor Jing Yi, whom you know rather well. And then one of the points he made about the current status of how, say, Chinese sanction, quote-unquote sanction on North Korea is being maintained. One of the points, which in fact, appealed very, very directly to my attention was this, which is he said last year he made 2 trips to North Korea, Pyongyang, and then he came to find that both in the airplane and then the train there were so many empty seats. He flew Air China, and then there were only 13 passengers in his plane. This year, they cannot get a ticket. Same number of flights and same number of train seats, but last year everything was so empty, and then this year you cannot get a ticket. So maybe that is something we have to keep in mind. But with respect to the point which has been raised by Dr. Bush as well as Ambassador Park about free riding. And then back in 2016, when there was presidential election in the United States, then of course I was in Washington, D.C., and had an ample opportunity to observe all those, say, campaign speeches that was being made by President Trump. And then oftentimes he said, free riders, there are free riders like West Germany or Japan or South Korea. And of course, each time he said that, then there was a ripple of concern being expressed in the Korean press. And I was speaking to one Korean correspondent in Washington, D.C., and then he said, well, I understand why Seoul is responding nervously when Mr. Trump talks about free riding, but at the same time, let us just think about it. Let's assume President Trump says there are rich and then, as a matter of fact, very capable countries, and then they are paying sufficiently. And then, if he had said Germany and Japan, and then if he had not mentioned Korea, how would you feel about that? How would you feel about that? So that was a comment coming from one of the journalists. And then I just look around this room, and then there are quite a few journalists. So thank you for the tip. And then, of course, I have all different reasons why. I could explain to President Trump if I have an opportunity to sit with him to tell him why, in fact, we are not free riders. But at the same time, I do not want to bore you at this late hour. Thank you.
Okay. In terms of the defense spending, I'd like to give you kind of an example that South Korea has built for the last 10 years or something. Okay. North Koreans deployed 300 to 350 long-range artillery very close to Seoul metropolitan area. That capability guarantees some kind of North Korea's security in these days. So I would call it that is a massive retaliation strategy. What is interesting in these days is that South Korea, for the last decade or some last, built up a capability of very short-range tactical missile, usually called KTSSM, Korean Tactical Surface Missile, whose range is 150 kilometer, and the missile itself is kind of cheap. It is $600,000 US dollars. In Korean currency, it is a chop. So we have, let's say, the North Koreans deployed 333 long-range artillery tubes against the Seoul metropolitan area, let's say. And if South Korea launched 3 missiles whose CEP, the circular error of probability, is 2 meters, which means that we have 87.5% probability to hit the target, and with at least 1 missile. Which means that with the first salvo, we can destroy North Koreans 87.5% of the long-range artillery. We all know the positions and the locations because they are just kind of fixed. And even though they have some kind of protected by the other side of the mountains, then we can just block their entrance or the exit. So we have technology. We are building the capability to neutralize North Korea's attack capability in these days. So money well spent, I believe.
Now, 2 minutes, behind the schedule. But I'd like allow just one or two questions. So if there's any, okay. I see none. Before we close, I'd like to recognize Professor Yen Se-tung from Tsinghua University, one of my beloved friends of mine. He's the dean of the Modern International Relations Institute of Tsinghua University, and he's an organizer of the world famous World Peace Forum. He suggested to have some subsession on Korea and China-Korean, bilateral security relations, every year. So I'd like to recognize, his great friendship and, great ideas to make both countries to develop further, a better relationship. So again, thanks so much for your tolerance. While in the other room, there are movie stars attract everybody's. So if I give just 2 words, first thing is, this is the last, remaining very few chance which we could rush to the extreme of the spectrum, including war or going, nuclear by everybody's, nuclear cascade or proliferation. So we should do our best. And then North Korean nuclear issues, as many of my colleagues agreed, there is a very good chance for China and the United States to avoid the trap of Thucydides, which will guarantee for durable peace and co-prosperity in this area. Again, thanks so much for your kind attention, and let's give a big hand for our excellent presentation.